Hello, welcome to Ask Miss Myrz, where we answer your most burning questions and solve your most nagging problems. I won't always know the answer, but I'll know someone who will. So, 15 more days, and it's goodbye to 2020, also known as the Annus Horribilis. And while we're not certain if 2021 will be better, what we have today is an expert who will help us reflect on what we learned in 2020 that helped us survive and also can help us learn the tools and the mindset it needs so that we can pivot towards a better future. Please welcome award-winning psychiatrist and former president of the Philippine Psychiatric Association, Mr. Rene Samaniego. Hello. Hi, Doc Sam.
Hi, Myrza.
How are
Thank you
you?
for good considering.
Thank you too. As you know, this is right now I am actually doing a very quick pivot because my laptop died and I am on my phone. So, ladies and gentlemen, so sorry if it looks different than the usual, but we'll do our best. So, how is your practice winding down in the next 15 days?
Well, yeah, like I was telling you earlier, I'm trying to pack in as many patients as I could because I'll be going on a break, which is something that I badly need as well. So I have about maybe 4 or 5 days to go, but I might have to see some urgent calls between Christmas and New Year.
Wow, right. And I thought like people are actually probably trying not to work so much anymore, but in your case, it's the opposite. So, looking back at 2020, I don't know if we can do like a recapitulation, like a brief one. I remember in July of this year when we interviewed you for Boys Night Out,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
it was like 3 months into the pandemic and you're quite busy. We couldn't pin you down. How did the year and your practice progress during the next 6 months?
Actually, it's still pretty much the same. No, it's as busy as ever, which I think is somewhat expected, considering, like I was telling you, the psychological impact or even the sequelae, from the psychiatric perspective of the global pandemic. So I'm actually keen on discussing your chosen topic for today's episode, because the reality is that for most of us, the year 2020 has really been mainly about surviving. It's
Right.
it's really just about seeing the year through to its end and really just trying to keep afloat. And in fact, in all honesty, I see us as needing to do that still to a certain extent in 2021. No, but perhaps we can also try to start modifying or reframing that paradigm of just surviving, such that our lives and our existence will no longer just be strictly about that, but thriving as well. No?
Right. So
Mm-mm.
you are optimistic that we can somehow thrive
Oh,
given
yeah, very
the
much
tools
so.
that
Very
you're going
much
to
so. Mm-mm.
provide us with. What actually did we learn, or maybe what did psychiatrists learn about humankind and adapting to what happened this year?
Mm-hmm. So maybe this is the part where we can do a little bit of reflection and review regarding our journey for 2020 and the COVID-19. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the psychological impact and the reactions to COVID-19,
Right.
like common psychiatric conditions or issues that have emerged thus far, right?
Right. Right.
So we are now going into the ninth month, if I believe, of COVID 19,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
since it was declared by the WHO as a global pandemic in March, right? So,
Right.
and I think we will all agree that at this point, um, it's been a wild roller coaster ride.
Right. Wild is an understatement.
Correct. Yeah, that's even an understatement. No? And if we're going to reflect on our COVID 19 journey from the get go, of course, our main concerns have been centered on how the virus can potentially threaten our physical well being, with
Right.
our strongest worry or fear being, what if I get infected by the virus? No?
Right.
Whether it's just us or even our loved ones. So we all have experienced that worry or fear to varying degrees.
Right.
And having said that, we want to highlight as early as now that it is a normal reaction for us to be apprehensive and anxious.
Right.
But of course, on top of that, there are other associated anxieties like, is our government and our healthcare system able to adequately manage this crisis? And if so, will they be able to continue to do that over time? So those kinds of things, no?
Right.
And then shortly after that, our worries turn into more personal stuff like, what if I lose my job? No? Or those who have actually lost their jobs, there's the question, how will I make ends meet?
Right.
Um, and even for us whose concerns are not as catastrophic, meaning we are not lacking in the basics, like we're still able to eat 3 times a day, we still have a roof over our heads. Still, to us, there's that challenge of juggling time within the new normal, as we call it, no? Which
Right.
for most of us may include like working from home, homeschooling the children, and stuff like that. So all of us are in this constant loop of the new normal with a constant chatter of worries going on in our heads. No?
Right.
Um,
And it can be
yeah,
quite overwhelming because you open social media and you're bombarded with so much stress.
yes, which is what we refer to as doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. Oh my god. Perfect.
Yeah. But I think what we're really pointing out here is that since the pandemic started, relatively little attention has been paid to the mental health consequences of it. Uh,
Yes.
And I guess to a certain extent that is quite understandable now, because most especially in the acute or earlier stages of the crisis, because at that time the emphasis should really be on the more urgent priorities anyways, like caring for the sick patients and tending to the needs of our healthcare providers so that they can meet the challenging medical demands while keeping them safe at the same time, right?
Right.
And then there's also the issue of working on containing the virus so further spread in the so further spread in the community can be prevented. um, we also had to expand our hospitals capacities, right, and putting up quarantine facilities to accommodate more patients. And then on top of all these, we also needed to work on developing more effective treatments for the virus because that's the first time we're dealing with such a thing. So there was that immediate need to attend to that because we were dealing with such a virulent and potentially fatal virus. So
Right.
there's attending to both the curative and the preventive, which is the COVID-19 vaccine.
Right.
Yeah.
And on a more possibly relatable level, what was the impact on the mental health of people? For example, your patients or the
Mm-mm.
people you dealt with. What did you observe? Were there any patterns?
Okay, so generally, there really has been this psychological distress and anxiety that all of us have experienced, right? So, to begin with, our lives and our daily routines have been completely disrupted. And for the past 9 months, we've actually been grieving the loss
Right.
of our former lives.
Right.
So, we are all essentially in grief at the moment, if you think
Right.
about it. And it's not the kind of grief that we feel when a loved one dies, no, because I think the grief over the loss that COVID-19 brought about is a little more complicated because it brings with it so much uncertainty. It's open ended, no?
Right.
And aside from that, we've been isolated from each other. No, there's the economic and the financial losses that we continue to accumulate over time. So all of these things can definitely have can have adverse effects on our mental and emotional well-being, and that is what we refer to, as I was saying earlier, as the psychological sequelae that will eventually emerge,
Wow.
even after the pandemic eases up.
Right. Is this what they were projecting to be a mental health pandemic after
Correct.
the
Correct.
pandemic?
Yep. And they say that that may actually persist for months or even years even after the end of the pandemic. So right now, what I'm saying is that we still do not know what the longer term effects of these psychological consequences will be. What we do know, however, is that even during the earlier stages of the pandemic, there have been case reports which have described psychiatric and psychological symptoms, even neurological symptoms, in fact, that were associated with COVID 19. So, for instance, in the province of Wuhan, where it was supposed to have all started, during the initial outbreak of the pandemic, they did a longitudinal study of psychological symptoms, which they actually repeated 4 weeks later at the peak of it. And they noted that the respondents reported high levels of anxiety, depression, as well as stress and distress, which was in fact also validated by an online survey later on that yielded more or less the same results. Now, with high rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, now alcohol use was
Oh,
also
wow.
present, and just really a decreased mental well-being among the respondents.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, there, and then after that, there were several other studies. There was a much bigger study, a nationwide surveillance conducted in the UK, which is supposed to be the largest and first ever nationwide study since the onset of the pandemic, which showed COVID 19 to manifest with acute psychiatric complications, such as there was mention of personality changes, triggering of manic episodes in bipolar patients, and even new onset psychosis. Uh,
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very disturbing.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
in the meantime, knowing all this, how is one to cope? How do we get
Mm-mm.
through until, I mean, it seems like next year is like a whole new scenario, but it's
Ball
only
game.
like two
Mm-mm.
weeks from now, and
Correct.
nothing might even change or things might even get worse.
Right. So I guess before I move into that, no, most importantly, no, this is very interesting. There were studies which show that COVID 19 patients who also had comorbid or simultaneous diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder showed consistently higher mortality rates
Oh,
as compared to, let's say, those who did not have a psychiatric diagnosis or psychiatric disorder. So, in other words, COVID 19 patients who were also psychiatric patients had a higher risk for death versus those who were only dealing with COVID 19 alone. And that this study came out relatively recently, like about a month ago.
wow.
So yeah, I guess needless to say, attending to our mental health during this time is actually very critical.
Right,
Maybe not only in keeping our sanity or
right,
psychological integrity, but perhaps even our physical survival, just like
right,
what I said a while ago.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. Right.
Mm-mm.
And also, as we discussed earlier, the old normal and the new normal and all those terms, we may never go back to what is normal. Like the
Mm-hmm.
new normal
Mm-hmm.
might be the normal, and this means like a global change in the way of life or the way
Right.
we will do things from now on. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think that is the reality that we all have to deal with, which is part of what I'm going to talk about later,
Right.
which is how to live with liminality or the
Yes.
uncertainty. You see what I
Yes.
mean?
Right.
So
We
yeah, maybe
define
not. Yeah,
liminality as the space between what is no longer and what will be.
correct. Yeah, between the
Right.
no longer and the not yet,
And then
like
not
that.
yet. So that's where we are now.
Yep, yep. All of us are there now. I mean,
Wow.
not to say that this is the first time we're experiencing that, because that experience of liminality is something that happens along the way in life for all of us. no? But I
Right.
think um, the uniqueness of that liminality that we're all experiencing now is that it's a global phenomenon.
Yes.
We all of us are dealing with it right now.
Right.
So yeah, what I thought was that for the remainder of the show, maybe we can share some like really practical strategies now that we
Yes.
can apply to
Right.
our daily lives, which hopefully can help us navigate ourselves
Yeah.
further in our journey with COVID
Right.
19.
So Dr.
Um,
Sam has provided 5 psychological strategies. Unfortunately, I cannot flash any of them on screen because I'm using my phone. So if
mhm,
you could please start it already, Doc Sam. Number one
sure.
is
So the number one important thing is to live more mindfully. So it's a very practical but highly useful psychological strategy that we should all be incorporating in our daily routines. At least personally, that's what I strongly believe. No? And that's mindfulness. Actually, I would prefer to call it not just a psychological strategy, but more of a practice or even a lifestyle.
right,
Because it will not only apply to patients, not it will not only apply to psychiatric patients or those who are experiencing psychological difficulties, but for all of us. That
right,
is part of what will move us from that survival phase to thriving.
right.
Um,
What's an easy way? I'm sure it's
hmm,
not easy, but what's the easiest way to live mindfully? I, for one,
okay,
am always like mindlessly forgetting things
sure.
or
Hmm,
confused
hmm,
all the time.
hmm. Um, so I suppose mindfulness is a word that a lot of us have either heard or come across by now. And the reason for that is because it is one area in the mental health field that we can say has caught quite a lot of interest and attention, especially in the last 2 decades or so. Although in actuality, it's been there for much longer now. So, what is mindfulness? Before I expound on it, I actually would like to ask you, Mirza, a
Okay.
question which I think would help you appreciate more the concept. And the question is, are you thinking about something other than what you are currently doing?
Yes, I am panicking because of the
Yeah,
technical difficulty. And so
yeah,
while
right.
interviewing you, I am actually.
Sure.
So there.
Hmm. So yon. In other words, since we started your show about how many minutes ago, have you been
Yeah.
strictly and solely focused on what has been happening, what we have
Yes.
been talking about so far?
Right.
Or if you will closely reflect on it, might you have had a thought that is not related to or outside what is happening in the moment, like what you had for lunch, what you had for breakfast, what you were going to have for dinner, or someone whom you might have talked to earlier,
Right.
or whatever you talked about might have that might be lingering in your head, or something important that you might have forgotten to do. No,
Definitely,
um,
because in this multitasking world that we live in with all the gadgets and all the bombardment of stimuli,
yep,
it's hard to be mindful.
right. And I'll be honest myself, no, because since we started, I actually thought of something important that I will need to do immediately after this.
Yes.
But but anyways, what I want to point out here is that that is the way our minds are built. It's actually the human condition, so to speak. So there were these two Harvard researcher psychologists by the name of Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert, and they wrote a scientific journal called, and this is an interesting title, A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind.
Okay.
And in that paper, they said that unlike other animals, human beings spend a lot of time thinking about what is not going on around them.
Oh.
So, in other words, contemplating on events that happened in the past,
Right.
events that might happen in the future, or actually events that might not happen at all.
Right.
So what we're saying is that we're almost never in the present moment.
And we are hardwired to think
Correct.
that
Yeah.
way.
That's really just the way it is. It's what we call stimulus independent thinking, or simply mind wandering.
Okay.
There's actually an area in the brain that is responsible for that, which is what we call the default mode network. No? So, anyway, in the paper, they tried to explore the emotional consequences of mind wandering in our everyday life. So, the general findings showed three things. First is that people's minds do wander frequently, nearly half of the time, in fact, regardless of what they were doing, except when they are doing one thing. And what do you have an idea what that might be? So
Meditating.
they're saying that when you're doing this thing, that's the only time you can concentrate.
Okay.
It's actually sex.
Oh,
I mean, go figure, right?
but the mind can wander during sex, can it
Sure,
not?
that's true. That's true. But anyways, that's what they found out.
All right.
So the second finding was that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
The third and last finding was that what people were thinking was a better predictor of happiness than what they were actually doing.
Oh, okay.
Which means that we can be in the midst of what is supposed to be a happy and personally meaningful occasion, but that wouldn't matter if what is on our minds are, the misfortunes that happen in our lives in
Right,
the
right,
past, or the catastrophic events that might befall us in the future, or even the challenge that we're facing now, which is the global pandemic, right? So I'm
right.
not going to go through so much details of the research, but in a nutshell, what the results of the study said was that a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So
That's good.
becoming, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was about to say, becoming aware of what is on our minds from moment to moment, as at least as much as we could, and how our experience is transformed when we do become aware, is really what mindfulness is all about. So simply put, it's grounding ourselves to the reality of the present moment.
Okay.
S-
So it
eh,
would help. So, how do we ground ourselves to the reality of the present moment?
It's really just by intention. When we catch ourselves either being in the past, so just like what we were saying earlier, when we from when we started the show, there were points wherein we were thinking of what I'm going to do after this, or what I did before this. So when we catch ourselves in that mode, all we need to do is to gently redirect ourselves back to what is happening in the present moment. Just to give a practical example, no, in psychiatry, even pre-pandemic, or before the advent of COVID-19, two of the most common conditions that we encounter in the clinics are depression and anxiety. Okay. And this still holds true even in the midst of the pandemic. And if we're going to relate depression and anxiety to mindfulness, when we are not mindful, taking into consideration that one important aspect of mindfulness is being fully in the present moment, or being in the here and now. If you look at just visualize a time frame. So let's say this is the time frame. Oops, there's a time frame.
Right.
Um, when one is not in the middle of that time frame is the here and now, or the present. So if you're not here in the middle of that time frame, which is the present moment, you can only be in two other time frames. And what is that?
The
It's
past and the
either correct. It's either the past or the future, whether immediate or distant past, or immediate or distant future. And the general rule in mindfulness is that, on one hand, when one is depressed, One, more often than not, at least, one is dwelling more about the
On the
past.
past. Yes.
And of course, when we think about the past, not uncommonly, we think of the mga should haves, would haves, could
Right.
haves, right?
Regret.
Yes. So all of those things that we did or did not do that we regret. You're right.
Right.
On the flip side, when you are thinking about the future, more so if you think about it catastrophically,
Right.
which means that you're thinking about the worst case scenario that might happen or the worst outcome of your present moment, then there's no way for you to not feel anxious.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And so while we are all longing for the old world ways where we could see our friends and live like a normal life, we're also anxious about the future because we're so uncertain about everything.
hmm hmm And how can you feel good, no, or at the very least feel relaxed or neutral when you're having catastrophic thoughts? It just it's just not logical or rational. It doesn't make sense, right? So as a simple rule, being more in the past than the present will make you more inclined to be depressed. And conversely, being more in the future than the present makes you more inclined to be anxious. Why is
Right.
that? Because that is simply the nature of the future. It
Right.
it is basically uncertain. We
Right.
did not expect that we will have technical problems in this moment, right? But it happened. It happened.
It did.
Um,
So
so
now
we
I'm
don't.
trying to enjoy the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It is what
Yes.
it is. It's not a big deal. So, um, let's
No
see.
wonder you're so calm.
Well, trying to be,
Right.
but remember, my mode is also like that because I'm a human being to begin with. So
Right.
I have a tendency to think about the past, about what's going to happen in the future. So I mean, we really just don't know what the future is going to bring. So for other countries, for example, we do not know exactly when the vaccine will come out, right?
Right. Right.
We do not know whether next week or next month we will be COVID free. We do not know that.
True. True.
On the other hand, on the other hand, if it so happened that at this point you have COVID-19 in this present moment, and you're constantly thinking about or worrying about your mortality, which is but natural, do you at least ever consider the possibility that a month from now you might actually be COVID free and you may be going about your usual activities and be fully functional? Because that's a
Right.
possibility.
True. Like we didn't know it would last 9 months, and imagine if we just worried about the future all the time.
Mm-hmm. So, in other
Right.
words, what if just for a while we let go of all those worries and apprehensions and just focus on this present moment?
Right.
Fully focusing on what is happening right now. Like me talking to you, I'm
Yes.
okay. I don't have symptoms of COVID-19. I have something to eat later, stuff like
Yeah.
that. Even for just a few cycles of our breathing, let's
Yes.
focus on that, which would take
Right.
maybe just a minute or two
Right.
out of the 24 hours. So if
Right.
in the process of doing so, you find your mind wandering somewhere else again, either to the past or the future or to a neutral thought, then just acknowledge that your mind has wandered and gently
Bring yourself
refocus.
back.
Correct, correct.
Right. Right.
So
Okay. So
that's actually a very basic and simple example of mindfulness exercise.
very
Yeah.
helpful. For number
Mm.
2, we have live creatively.
Okay. So another possible avenue towards thriving and not just surviving is to live a little more creatively. And what does this mean? Um, Maybe not a lot of people know that creativity or the creative process actually plays a vital role in psychotherapy. So, in
Right.
fact, in most countries, there are existing formal organizations or societies under which the creative arts profession would fall.
Right.
So we have art therapy, we have music therapy, there's dance or movement therapy, there's drama therapy, poetry therapy, and psychodrama, just to give a few examples. Um, and maybe we can take one of the most common examples, which is art therapy. I think a lot of people have come across that concept.
I think it's helping a lot of people now, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. And when we think about the word art, I think a lot of us have a tendency to limit the idea to mainstream examples like paintings or sculptures or architecture. But from the psychological perspective, art is much, much more than that. So, art is not just the piece itself, but rather the encounter between the piece and the artist,
Oh.
or even just the observer. Let's say you go to a museum and you look at a work of art. There's interaction going on there. So, for example, I mentioned about Carl Jung in our previous
Yes, yes, yes.
show, right? Um, who was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. I said Carl Jung actually was an artist,
Oh.
but he was more of a visual art. He was more into the visual arts. No, he actually came up with a book which he called the Red Book, and which was published posthumously, actually way after his death, which mostly contained a collection of his artworks and his reflections.
Okay.
So, at the most basic level, what art really does is to provoke reflections.
Right. Right.
Um, I remember it being said that if the work of art gets the artist or even just the observer to enter into a reflection, then it has actually done its work.
Right. Right. For the third, we have live meaningfully.
Mhm. So, actually, maybe we can leave that in the end, no? Because that's
Okay.
actually a summary of everything we've talked about there.
All right.
So there's a living prayerfully, right?
Right.
Um,
If you're not religious, could we say living spiritually?
that could be very well so.
Right.
Maybe before we get any strong reactions from the non-believers, right? I'm talking about prayer more from the secular paradigm.
Okay.
According to Thomas More, who is a renowned author, he's also a psychotherapist, and his practice is more from a psycho-spiritual perspective. He said that prayer does not have to be exclusive for believers or those who normally adhere to a specific creed or religion. Again, it can be the idea of just sitting silently and maybe opening yourself to the present moment and perhaps asking for comfort and healing. Or sometimes you may also do that in the midst of nature. So that's an example. In fact, he said that there's something special about a non believer who, in being in the moment of losing all hope, suddenly and just naturally blurts out a prayer,
Right.
because it's a possible breakthrough or a shift from a concrete or materialistic or physical existence to a more open and receptive existence where we account for the possibility of mystery or the unknown or the uncertainty. Uh,
Right.
so there's something special about that.
Right.
So, in the end, anyway, the point is that a crisis, which is what we're experiencing right now, globally, in fact, it may very well bring about that breakthrough and that shift that we are
Right.
talking about,
A global shift.
a
In
global shift. A global, and the shift can also very well be personal. Uh,
right.
It may open us to being receptive about ideas, whether religion or otherwise, that before we might be too closed about.
Right.
Okay.
So when you say includes meditation, do you
Mhm.
suggest that we make it a daily practice in order to help us cope, or
Yes. Um, there are actually two main ways to practice mindfulness. One is the formal practice, which involves meditation, and the other is the informal practice, which is basically being mindful, applying mindfulness in everything that we do, whether it's eating,
Right.
walking, brushing your teeth, because we can apply mindfulness in a lot of activities. Eh?
Yes. I do a lot of mindless eating myself, stress
Mhm.
eating.
Sure, sure.
That's where the
Yeah.
problem lies.
And when you do that, of course, there are issues like weight gain.
Yes.
Because if only you're able to be conscious na I mean, you are eating, but you realize that, wait a minute, I'm not hungry.
Yes,
And that
exactly.
would involve mindfulness, right?
Right.
It would
That's why
involve
they
mindfulness.
call it the COVID 15 pounds
Oh,
from mindless stress eating.
sure, sure. Yeah. I think
Right.
that's very relevant.
The next one is the
So,
keyword live with liminality.
yes. Um, so this is actually definitely not the least. No? It's to recognize the importance of living with liminality. So first, what is liminality? Liminality actually came from the Latin word limina, which means threshold.
Right.
So if you stand right in the exact doorway between two rooms in your house, then you will more or less know what liminality means or
Yeah.
liminality feels, or you'll get an idea. So, as we were saying earlier, liminality is that place where we are no longer where we used to be,
Yes.
but at the
And
same time, we are not yet where we are supposed to be or where
right.
we are headed towards.
Right. So we're just in between. But this is
Right.
like our whole life, right? We
Sorry.
are our whole life is liminality.
Not necessarily. There are certain events that stand out that
Okay.
would epitomize the essence of liminality. For example, grief.
Okay.
When
True.
we lose somebody, so we are no longer in that place where we are with that person, but we are not yet in the place where we are back in the mainstream of life.
Right.
So, in
Right.
other
Right.
words, we stay in that space for a while. Uh,
Right.
So, we were saying it's that space between the no longer and the not yet.
Yes.
In fact, according to Father Richard Rohr, who is an American author, a spiritual teacher, and a Franciscan friar who wrote a lot about liminality, he said that liminality is a special psychological and spiritual place where transformation happens.
Okay.
And if we
Wow.
consider it closely, the approaching of a new year or the new year itself is essentially a liminal space. For instance, there seems to be something really significant with the year 2020. Because- uh, yeah, because if you think about it, 2020 is not just a new year, but actually a new decade.
That's true.
And there is something major, there's something about major life events or major life shifts, such as entering into a new decade, that carries with it potential major internal changes as well.
Wow. In
I don't know if you remember the global panic we had over the Y2K in the
yes.
year 2000, remember?
Change of millennium.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that was such a strong universal energy, if you remember it. And
Yeah.
mind you, that was not just a new decade, but a new millennium.
A new millennium. And
See?
everybody hoarded water,
Yeah.
food.
Um, yeah. Then again, it doesn't have to be a new millennium or a new decade because the arrival of the new year, a new year itself,
Right.
usually carries with it major events.
Right.
Again, if you remember the big Indian Ocean earthquake that brought about the huge tsunami
Yeah.
in Phuket and
2006,
Bali, 2000,
I think.
no, I
Or
think that was
sorry,
2004,
earlier
going
2004.
2005. Yeah.
Right, right, right.
I remember it actually happened the day after Christmas. Eh. So
Yeah.
4 days, 4 days before the New Year, right?
Right, right.
So I mean, that's what I mean. Or we don't even have to look too far because we had that Taal volcano eruption in
Right,
January of this year.
right, right.
So another thing about liminality is that it definitely is a place wherein we are not in control.
Such as this whole year.
Sure. Which in reality, control is largely an illusion anyways, right?
Right, right,
Because there are a lot of things that are not within our control. But
right,
unfortunately, control is one of our most favorite illusions.
right. So when you say live with liminality, what essentially should our mindset be?
it's um it's setting the framework of acceptance of the reality of the uncertainty and mystery of the space.
Right,
But the thing is, we do not live with uncertainty well, diba?
right.
For sure, we
Especially
weren't.
for type A personalities like myself.
Well, a lot of us are like that.
Yeah,
Well, for one, we were never taught in school how to live with uncertainty, but that is such a very basic life skill, I think.
yes. And maybe now it will be taught in schools.
Hopefully, yeah,
Part of the global shift.
yeah. And another thing about 2020 is that if we do not take it too literally, I mean, meaning the number 2020 just being a year, right?
Right.
2020 is used to describe the visual status of someone whose visual ability is at its
Yeah.
clearest or
Like
most
vision
ideal. Yeah.
2020.
Mm. So when the ophthalmologists say you have 20/20 vision, it means that your vision is perfect. So in the same manner, I just like to point out, I believe personally that the year 2020, despite its challenges, also carries with it strong potential for clarity in
Right.
terms of our inner vision, like getting to know ourselves better, like what do I value more? What do I fear? What what do I further aspire for in life, or which direction I would want it to go. So something
Right.
like that.
And
So in short,
what matters most, what we should let go of already.
mhm, yep. So the most important place for us to start in dealing with liminality is to recognize how things were and how we have been in the world no longer works, and we cannot go back to that anymore. So we need to be able to learn to try to tolerate the anxiety that comes
Right.
with being in that liminal space. And we have been talking about specific strategies like mindfulness,
Right.
creativity, prayer, meditation, stuff like that.
Right.
And the last, which is living more meaningfully, actually we don't need to expound on that too much anymore, because living more meaningfully, I think, can be a natural byproduct of all
Right.
of the first four things that we mentioned,
Right.
that I've
If we
discussed.
do 1 to 4, then we will have lived meaningfully.
Yep. Mhm.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, hopefully, I mean, those are really just very practical stuff, but that's not the be all and end all, I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that can help us aside from that.
Right. What is your message or your hopes or general advice for everyone in the next 2 weeks where we are aspiring to thrive instead of just survive in 2021?
Mm, I think the most basic really is to live life more consciously. We can no longer just go through life unknowingly or unconsciously. Yung parang flowing with it,
Right, right.
with
Coasting
um
along, drifting along.
yes, coasting along or drifting along unknowingly,
Right,
which I think largely what we've been doing for a while. So that's
right,
why I was saying I think 2020, again, despite the difficulties, provides us that potential, now
right,
that opportunity for us to live our lives more consciously.
right. What a great message. And thank you so much, Doc Sam.
Sure,
Beautiful
Mirza.
tips.
My
tips.
pleasure.
And I know you have a webinar coming up. So just to sum up, live mindfully, live creatively,
Mhm.
live prayerfully, live with liminality. And if you do 1 to 4, you will have lived meaningfully. Thank you so much. Dr.
Absolutely.
Sam, would you like to invite everyone to follow your Facebook page and also show us your new book? You're part of a book that
Oh
was released
yes, yes.
the other
So
day. Do you have
so
a
you
copy
can,
over there?
yes, actually I do. Here
Yes,
you
please
go.
show us. Vessel
So
Voices.
speaking of living more creatively, so just allow me to share with your audience one of my most important, if not the most important, pandemic projects, which is to come up with a book together with 11
Right.
other authors. It's actually an anthology of Filipino memoirs called Vessel of Voices. All the contributors here, we are actually classmates in a creative writing course called Deep
Oh,
Memoir.
I
Yeah, so
see.
it's a relatively small class, and there are actually just 12 of us, so the 12 authors in the book. Our teacher is Jennifer Selig, who is actually a faculty staff at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. She
Okay.
also holds a PhD in psychology and regularly teaches deep conducts deep memoir courses. So it's called Vessel of Voices. So there are 12 of us contributors are from diverse disciplines, actually. So there's me, who's a psychiatrist. We have Sonia Rocco, who's a staunch supporter of education and culture and the arts. She also directed our virtual book launch. So we had a virtual book
Oh,
launch last Saturday, which was hosted by Miss Charo Santos Concho. Barbara Gonzalez was also there. So she shared
right.
some of her reflections and inspirations about the book.
Right. What did you write about?
I actually wrote about my experience of grief when I lost my mom in
Oh,
2014.
okay.
So the best way I can describe this book is that it's a work of love which celebrates family, it celebrates childhood memories, hardships past,
Right.
triumphs gained, and just lifelong learnings.
Right. Very timely for today when
Yep.
we look back to our past and cherish what was and use it to help us to cope with the struggles for next year. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam.
Thanks, Mirza.
Such
Thank
a
you for having
pleasure.
me.
And again, apologize for the technical difficulties and hope to see you
No
again
problem.
soon. Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. All right.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.